everyone, my name is Sophia and today I'm going to talk about the Cosmere reading order. So, quickly, just a life update, just real quick. If you don't care, jump to when I have my hand down. So this is the life update, basically. I had exam week and it killed me. It was awful. And I studied so much, I made so many notes that I hurt my hand, I hurt my wrist. And so I couldn't really type for a while and I couldn't write for a while. I just was off social media for like a week or so. If you're like, wait, is she ignoring me? No, I'm just not on social media for a while. We're here to talk about the Cosmere reading order. This is a video I've tried to do. I think this is the 4th time I've tried to do this because I never have like a structure for it. I just start talking about the Cosmere and it never really gets anywhere. So I hope this one works out. And if you clicked on this video, just for clicking on this video, and you're like, what is the Cosmere? Well, let me tell you. The Cosmere is a fantasy universe created by the author Brandon Sanderson, where it spans multiple solar systems in the same universe, and all of them have the same like overall basis for the magic system and for the physics laws of the universe, but they are very different stories set in different planets and different magic systems with very different characters. And in this point in time, you can read any Cosmere story separately without having to read the rest, like except for like stories that are midway through a series. You can pick up any of these and read them individually without having to have read other things from the Cosmere to fully understand them. I'm here to give you like a direction if you want to read the Cosmere and actually get to know the universe, not just the individual series. And if you want to just like really understand the connections, the origins of this universe, all of the things that are connected, and you can read them. Again, you can read them without knowing all of this, but knowing the Cosmere, knowing the origin of it, and knowing the basic laws, it's such a different and amazing experience. So if you're interested in that, I hope you pick up the Cosmere, figure out the order you want to read them in, because there is not one set order. It's about how you feel, and yeah, let's get right into it. For people who have never read the Cosmere before, or have never read Sanderson before, or haven't really read adult fantasy before, I always recommend these 3. And it's Warbreaker, Elantris, and the Final Empire. I recommend these 3 because 2 of these, Warbreaker and Elantris, I can't use this hand to hold up books, but Warbreaker and Elantris, they are both standalones for now. They won't stay standalones forever, but since Sanderson has so many things he needs to write, as of now they are standalones, and they are really, I think, accessible writing-wise to a variety of audiences, because Sanderson's writing is very invisible and straightforward. It's not pretty writing, it's not pretty prose. He doesn't pay much attention to his prose because he has said himself he prefers to have invisible writing so that it can be a clear window into his characters and his worlds and his magic. Let's say you want to start with one of the standalones. I recommend you start with Warbreaker if you're okay with slower books and politically driven books. But Warbreaker is the story of 2 sisters. One of them has been raised her whole life to go to this other country and be part of a political alliance through marriage to this godlike figure called the God King. He is very mysterious, we don't know much about him, and this girl has been raised her entire life to marry the God King. There's her other sister who has just been neglected by her father her entire life and just like been left aside to do whatever she wants. But then, in a last minute decision, their dad is like, wait, I like this one too much, the one who was supposed to go marry the guy, the God King. So he sends the unprepared, neglected daughter instead in her place. So Warbreaker is the story of Ciri, who has to marry the God King, and she hasn't been prepared for court. She hasn't been prepared. She doesn't really know what to expect. She's very naive in regards to that, and it's her story and her growth in that setting. And Vivenna, the sister who was supposed to go marry the God King, and she sets off to rescue her sister, and shenanigans ensue. She meets this grumpy old guy who's incredible, I love him, and this talking sword, and it's slower than some of his other books. Some of his other books we're going to talk about. This one is slower. It's more politically driven. I'd say it's more character driven as well, but this one has such a cool magic system, and I think it's a great introduction to Sanderson. If you want like cool magic but also politics and not something that's like at a breakneck pace and just want to like simmer with these characters for a while, I highly recommend Warbreaker. But then you say, okay, but slower, politically driven is not really my style, but I still want to stand alone. For that, I recommend you start with Elantris. And Elantris is also politically driven, but it's more like one big central conflict, which is what's going on with the city and the characters regarding the city. Elantris is about the city of Elantris, which was once a like big sprawling city of magical beings and people, and it was just like this big metropolis. And the people who were chosen to go to that city, they woke up one day with like magic and glowing and stuff, so they were sent to the city. Then for some reason, people started waking up with a type of plague instead, and the Elantrians were also taken by that plague and their magic went away. So now this city is just like a big repository for zombies, like zombie-like people, for people affected by this plague. And one of our main characters, Raoden, he's the prince of the nation that surrounds Elantris. And one day, I think near his wedding, he's struck by this plague and he's sent to Elantris. And his family tells everybody he died because like it's a really shameful thing. We are also following Serene, who is the woman he was supposed to marry, and her dealing with the court and like, is he really dead? Is he not dead? Dealing with the politics of that. We also follow Hrathen. He is a ambassador slash missionary slash crazy religious dude from another country who believes that if he doesn't convert the people from this region, everybody's going to be doomed. So we follow these three characters. We follow what's wrong with Elantris. We follow Raoden inside Elantris. We follow Serene dealing with the politics. This is also not super fast-paced, but it's more fast-paced than Warbreaker, in my opinion. And this one, there's a caveat here. If you're interested in it, please pick it up. But in my opinion, it's not the best place to start with Sanderson because this is his debut. And to be honest, it's not his best work. I gave this one 3.5 out of 5 stars because while it is entertaining, it lacks so much of the complexity and maturity in writing that Sanderson has gained through time. So if you're okay starting with his widely regarded as his worst book, it's not bad by any means, Still a Cosmere book, but it's not his best work. If you're okay with that, then sure, start with this one. It's just not what I recommend. If you really want to get hooked and just read the rest of the Cosmere, like binge it and be desperate to read it, this is not the one I recommend the most. Although there are many people who absolutely love this, that is my personal recommendation. We are now done with the standalones, and the other book I recommend if you want to start the Cosmere is the one I personally started with, and it's The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. Just let me like give you a heads up about the structure of this series. This first book is part of a trilogy, but Sanderson is also doing some eras with Mistborn. So this is Era 1. Era 2 is set 200 years, 300 years after this arc has ended. Era 3 is going to be set in like a 1980s detective type story. And Era 4 is going to be a big space opera that spans the entirety of the Cosmere. So far we only have this first trilogy. We have 3 books out of 4 of the second era. We're probably going to get the second era by 2022, I think. The end of the second era. But this first book is about a very oppressed world where like 1,000 years ago there was supposed to be a hero who was going to save everybody, but instead the Dark Lord won. So they've been ruled by a Dark Lord for 1,000 years, and there's this noble class and the Ska class, which are the people who are like actually oppressed. They live on the streets. It's awful. They're slaves. It's awful. And so we follow mainly this girl named Vin. She is 16 in this first book, and she is a street urchin, part of a thieving crew which runs small cons in noblemen. Then one day this guy named Kelsier shows up at her thieving crew and is like, I want you to join my crew so that we can kill the evil lord who's been ruling for 1,000 years. We're going to overthrow him. So that's the plot. Vin learning to trust and learning to love and learning to come onto herself as a person and as a woman and as somebody who has power. It is fantastic. I have an entire review dedicated to the series that I reread for the second time this year, and I think this is a great place to start with Sanderson. Probably the best in my opinion, because it's At the same time, it's not his best work. I think his best work is something else. I think this is such a fantastic series. It really shows his skill with magic and world building, and especially foreshadowing. Once you finish the trilogy, holy shit. The foreshadowing here is masterful. And it just really shows a lot of his strength while also being super entertaining and so fun. And it's not slow paced, but it's also not fast paced. I think this has a perfect pacing for a story of this like scope, because they're trying to kill a immortal god dude, you know? And this is the one I started with. I read this and then I binged 14 other Sanderson books. So you can see how it's like a gateway drug. And you can read this one as a standalone. It wraps up very, very well, but I'm pretty sure you won't. You'll want to continue with the series. This, again, is a great place to start. It gets so many things that Sanderson is good at, and it condenses it into one book or 3 books. And yeah, for me, this is the best place to start. Now we're going to another book that is not usually recommended as the best place to start, but I think it's a good place to start, and it's The Way of Kings. And this is the first book in the Stormlight Archive. This is part 2, meaning there are 2 books of this size, more or less, that comprise The Way of Kings, because this is over 1,000 pages long, and this is part of the Stormlight Archive, a series that is going to be 10 books long, each of them more or less 1,000 pages. And if you're thinking, that's way too long, no way that needs it, no way I'm going to read that. First of all, it absolutely needs it. It's such a huge story with huge scope and huge magic and world building and arcs, and it's just, insane. And you absolutely should read it, because even though it is really, really big, it's just the best thing I have ever read. I will try to sum this up for you, which is nearly impossible. This is about a world where every, I don't know how many years, there was a big event called the Desolation, which is when these beings called the Voidbringers would come and they would try to destroy humanity. But each time the Desolation came, these beings called the Knights Radiant, which are people with magical powers, and Spren, which you only know of if you read the series, they would come as well. And so they would fight the Voidbringers and usually win the Desolation, but it's a cycle. So every time the Desolation would come again, and the Knights Radiant would have to return, and they would have to fight again and fight again and fight again, until something happened, which is like the prologue of this first book, and the Knights Radiant are no more. They betrayed humanity. And so, apparently, in the Stormlight Archive, the true Desolation is coming. The Desolation that will actually end humanity. And the Knights Radiant are nowhere to be seen. Now, in this first book, especially, we follow 3 main characters. The first one is Dalinar, and his brother, 6 years ago, was killed. His brother was the king, and he was killed. Apparently killed by these group of people called the Parshendi. And so for the past 6 years, they've been waging war against the Parshendi. And Dalinar is the uncle of the current king and the brother of the dead king, and he is a high prince, so he commands this army, but he's also super honorable dude. He wasn't, but he's now a super honorable dude, but he's receiving visions from their so-called god that God is dead and the true Desolation is coming back. We follow another character who was a soldier and a apprentice to a field medic. His dad was a field medic, and now he's been sold into slavery, and he has to carry bridges through these plains that were shattered, the shattered plains, and so that soldiers can cross them and fight the Parshendi. And we also follow Shallan, who is trying to become a ward to like the most famous scholar in their country, who is also the sister of the king. But Shallan might have some not so noble reason to try to be a ward to this scholar. And magical things are kind of happening. Weird things are happening. Is the Desolation really come again? Is God really dead? What the hell are Spren? And just so many questions that this series is just fantastic. If you're okay with reading a 1,000-page book and just like taking a little bit for you to get placed in the world, I would highly recommend this book. Personally, I wouldn't recommend you start with this one, because if you start with Sanderson's best, everything else is gonna kind of fail in comparison. That's my logic behind it, because personally, this is the best thing I have ever read. In my opinion, this is the best thing Sanderson has ever written. So if you start with this, and then you go to like Elantris, Elantris is gonna feel a little bit less good, you know? Because truly, nothing compares to the Stormlight Archive. So if you want to start with this, go for it. If you can, if you're okay with waiting a little bit for you to be placed in this world and to really understand what's going on, go for it. But personally, I would say wait until you read like the Mistborn trilogy or Warbreaker. Oh, by the way, it is not like law, you don't have to, but I highly recommend reading Warbreaker before book 2 in the Stormlight Archive called Wars of Radiance, because some characters might appear, some things, you know, you can notice. I read all of Stormlight before I read Warbreaker, and I didn't, like, I could completely understand it, but there are some Easter eggs that are just fantastic if you know what they are. So yeah, I would highly recommend that. Now, those books I just talked about, I think you can read them in any order you like. If you want to start with like Elantris, then jump to Stormlight, then jump to Warbreaker, then jump to Mistborn, go for it. Those I think are good place starters, and you can read pretty much any of them next, and I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing for you to read any of those 4 books / series I talked about, but like remember to read, if you want to read Warbreaker before Words of Radiance. And also there are some little like stories, short stories between books, so I would recommend you read Secret History, Mistborn Secret History, after you read Mistborn 3. I think a lot of people will disagree with me and say you should read it after Stormlight, after Mistborn 6, but personally I say read it after Mistborn 3. It's more fun that way. And you also should read Edge Dancer between Words of Radiance and Oathbringer. It's like a short story about this character named Lift that really adds to like what she was doing, some things regarding some powerful people, and hints about where the story is going. Elantris, there's this story called Emperor's Soul, which is not like directly tied to the book Elantris, but it's set in the same planet, and it's called, it's Emperor's Soul. It's just such a good short story. I think it won a Hugo or a Nebula. One of those two. It really is Sanderson showing how good he is at magic systems. I don't think it's outstanding, personally, because short stories are not usually my thing, but yes, I would recommend you read those short stories in between these books I already talked about. Now we're going to talk about a few books you should not start with. First of them is White Sand. This is a graphic novel, and out of the books that have been published so far, this one is like #1 chronologically. Not like it was the first one published, but it's the first one in the in-universe timeline. So it would be Dragonsteel, and then this, I think. Dragonsteel has not been released yet or officially written. And I don't recommend you start with White Sand because first off, you kind of miss the subtle world building and subtle character work that Sanderson does when you're reading graphic novels. And I don't think this is a good introduction to the Cosmere because it doesn't really touch on, as far as I know, because I've only read volume 1, like bigger Cosmere things like shards and the Shatter and other things. This is just a really focused story. If you're really into graphic novels, I guess you could read this one, but I don't think this is a good entry point for the Cosmere. I think you should read this like when you've read most of the books we've already talked about, or all of them. You should not start with this one because this is not a book. You should not read this one first because first of all, it has many stories that if you haven't read Words of Radiance, book 2 in Stormlight Archive, you can read Edge Dancer, that is here. If you haven't read at least to book 3 of the first Mistborn trilogy, you can't read Secret History. And I think there are minor spoilers in between the stories because between the stories there are like little essays about the planet they're set in, and they are written by this character named Chris, who shows up in White Sand. And Chris is a scholar, and she is, according to Brandon, the most knowledgeable person in the Cosmere, about the Cosmere, or even in Hoyd, which we're gonna get there. Like, this is really cool if you know what the Cosmere is and you know what the Shattering is, if you've done a little bit of your research, but I would not recommend you start with this one because, first of all, you can't read most of the short stories here, and you can't really appreciate the Cosmere if you just read like Shadows for Silence in the Forest of Hell or Six of the Dusk. You can't really appreciate the Cosmere through those. So yeah, don't start with this one. And also, dear God, please, don't start with Ally of Law. This is the first book in the second era of Mistborn. Notice I said second era because it's supposed to be read after the first era. You might be able to understand the first one, but there's also he doesn't re-explain the magic system here, really. He just builds up on what we already know of Era 1, so it would be terrible to start with this. First of all, you'll be really confused with the magic system, and an antagonist that comes up later in the series, you're not gonna really like understand it and freak out over it, as the rest of us who have read all of Mistborn do. That was a Cosmere reading order. Notice I didn't like specifically say read this one, then this one, then this one, then this one, because I wanted to leave a little bit more open. I'm just giving you places to start and places to go at after, and yeah, just read this one after you've read Era 1, read this one after you've read most Cosmere books. Same thing with Arcanum Unbounded. The other ones, mix and match. Doesn't matter. The other ones, meaning Warbreaker. Again, recommended that you read it before Stormlight 2, because there's like some hints. Yeah, recommended, but you don't need to. You can absolutely start with this one, or read it second or third or fourth or fifth. You can absolutely start with Elantris, although this is not my personal recommendation. You can also read it first, second, third, fourth, fifth. Way of Kings, you can absolutely start with this one. I think this is Sanderson at his best. If you really want to read this one, just go for it. There's nothing stopping you. I hope you read some books between Stormlight and other Cosmere books, so that you can just have a little break of, okay, they're not gonna be as insane as Stormlight, you know? Just don't be disappointed if not everything is level Stormlight, because Stormlight is just like Stormlight is here, other books are here. Cosmere books are here, other books are here. It's just like a whole other level. Final Empire or Mistborn trilogy, overall, my personal recommendation if you want to start the Cosmere or just adult fantasy period, super accessible. So many people love this book. This has such wide mass appeal, and I started with this one. I think this is a great entry point. I think everybody can love this, but you can also read it first, second, third, fourth, fifth. Just please obey the order of the Mistborn series. That was a Cosmere reading order. I just want to mention Hoid real quick. Hoid is a character that was present the origin of the Cosmere, called the Shattering. I wouldn't recommend you read about the Shattering before you've read at least Mistborn 1, the first Mistborn era, but Hoid is basically immortal. He's been around since the Shattering, and he shows up in every Cosmere book and short story except for Shadows for Silence in the Forest of Hell, set in Threnody, and Six of the Dusk, Seth is something else, set in First of the Sun. He just shows up literally everywhere, and there are a few things that you might notice that might help you identify Hoid. He usually shows up as a beggar, or just like a really eccentric, weird dude. He usually offers to tell a story or play something with his flute, and he's usually just very obnoxious, very weird little man who's like thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. So that's Hoid. If you want, look out for him. He's a very important person. We don't really know his motives yet, but he shows up everywhere. I will give you a hint if you want. He shows up in Stormlight, Way of Kings. This is Warbreaker shit. He shows up in Way of Kings by the name of Wit, the King's Wit. If you want to look for that, be my guest. So yeah, I guess that was the order of the Cosmere. Again, didn't give you a like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 order. I just gave you places to start and then places to go after and books to not start with. I hope that helped you somehow. If you want to talk to the Cosmere, talk to me in the comments. My DMs on Twitter are also always open for people who want to talk about the Cosmere, or Gideon the Ninth, by the way. And I hope this like helped you pick up the Cosmere or piqued your interest. And if you've already read the Cosmere, first of all, what are you doing here? Second of all, thanks. My name is Sophia, and I'll see you next time. Bye!